You surface from the underground at Piccadilly Circus,
Mind the gap.
making your way through the glittering lights of London's West End. You take a turn down a quaint-looking street into the notorious neighborhood of Soho. The lights are up, the crowd is buzzing, and you, yes, you just stepped into the best seat in the house. Welcome to The Big Smoke, a variety show podcast. I'm Kevin Bennett, and I'll be your guide through this experience of comedy, conversation, and community. What do the things we choose to wear say about us? Today's episode dives into the meaning and significance of the objects we bring into our lives, especially our clothes. We kick things off with Patrick Grant, founder of Community Clothing and a judge on the Great British Sewing Bee, who joins us to talk about clothing, its history, and the difference between quality and fast fashion. Then, it's story time with a piece called Granny's Costume Trunk. And finally, we debut an exciting new segment, Archie's Neuro Nuggets, quick, actionable insights inspired by the emerging field of neuroaesthetics. This week's nugget, fractals in nature and why they might just make your life better. But first, it's time to play Stump the Room. Want to leave your friends scratching their heads this week? Try one of these trivia questions and see if you can stump any room you walk into. First up, the word tailor comes from the French word tailler. What does it mean? Think you know it? Hold that thought. Next, while the term bespoke existed before Savile Row's golden era, it became closely linked to the street's master tailors in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Originally, the word meant to order or arrange in advance. But in tailoring, what did it specifically refer to? And finally, in 1840, Queen Victoria set a fashion trend that's still popular today. What was it? Think you know the answers? Stick around, you'll find out at the end of the episode. It's time to welcome our first guest. He's the author of the Sunday Times bestseller, Less, a British fashion designer and one of the most influential voices in global fashion today. But here's a fun twist. He also reignited the legacy of my great-great-great-great-grandfather, Edward Tautz, by relaunching his clothing brand. So please give a warm welcome to Patrick Grant. Hi, Patrick. Thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to The Big Smoke. Okay, we have a unique connection, and I don't know if you remember, but we met 10, 15 years ago. I'll just briefly say how I'm linked to Tautz. So basically, Edward Tautz, or how do you pronounce it?
Well, we said Tautz.
You're probably right.
No, I
said to my grandfather, because I talked to him after we spoke the other day, and I said, well, Patrick pronounces it Tautz or something like that. And then he's like, well, we're probably wrong, because he heard it from his mom, who was not that far down. I'll tell what it is in a second. But like my grandfather said, his mom was born in Canada. He's like, oh, she was Canadianized. She was probably has no idea, whatever.
Well, I think we anglicized it, but it was a Central European name, I guess.
Okay, so Edward Tautz, eldest son, Tautz and Sons. The sons had a bunch of sons. The son, in fact, I don't know. You're going to tell me what you know.
No, I don't. Yeah.
Okay, so the son had. So here's the first one. I can show you this in a second. He had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 kids. Tautz and Sons.
Yeah. So to put this in context,
yes,
Edward Tautz was a very celebrated London tailor who had worked at another tailoring house called Hammond & Co.
Yeah.
He had left Hammond & Co. to set up on his own, taking with him, obviously, some very punchy clients, including a couple of European royals, set up on Oxford Street in front of what is now Selfridges, in probably the most prestigious address at the time in London's kind of shopping district, wealthy shopping district in the West End that was at that time the be-all, the end-all of London. And he built this amazing business. And he invented the knickerbockers. He became the kind of preeminent sporting tailor when sporting tailoring was really a thing because everybody rode horses to work
Yeah.
and, we lived in this very different way. I mean, very, very aristocratic client base. Winston Churchill thought they were the greatest tailoring house in London. There's a letter from Winston Churchill to his parents sent from Harrow School that's in the Churchill archives in Cambridge that says, please send me Tautz breeches for they're the best in the world or whatever. And this was your relation.
Okay, so yeah, I'll go through.
When I bought Norton and Sons in the early 2000s, Tautz and Sons was part of Norton and Sons. Norton and Sons had bought that business in the 1960s, merged it into their business, and it had sort of just it sat on the letterhead, but nowhere else. Dennis, who was one of our tailors at Norton's, Dennis had been working for Norton's when they acquired Tautz, and Dennis had worked on the Tautz clothes. So they still made for the Tautz clients in the Tautz way, from the Tautz patterns and so on. And over time, they just sort of, those clients disappeared and it all merged into one thing and it just became Norton and Sons. So I restarted it in 2009 as a ready-to-wear sibling of Norton and Sons, because Tautz had also done ready-to-wear. They had ready-made riding clothes and hunting accoutrements and all sorts of random stuff that doesn't exist anymore for pastimes that happily don't exist anymore, like things like otter hunting and whatnot. But they made ladies' riding habits. They made for the Empress of Austria and the Queen of Spain, and so they were doing women's and men's sort of ready to wear. But
so my question is, so I met you around either 2010 or 2012, so not long after you relaunched it.
Yeah.
And so it was really exciting. And I'd been to London a couple times. I wasn't living here at the time. And so I just did a quick Google and saw it came up. And so therefore I just wandered into the location on Savile Row, and you happened to be in the back. I did this really random thing where I went up to somebody and I said, "This is gonna sound weird, but I am related to Edward Tautz. I don't know why I'm telling you this. Who's the person who owns this place?" or whatever, something like that.
Yeah.
And they went, "Hang on a second," and ran to the back.
Yeah.
You came out. Yeah. So all the details that you had in terms of, maybe the Winston Churchill letter is easy-ish to find because there's lots of archives of him.
It's well organized.
But what about everything else? How did you find? Because the whole story was easy for me to find, probably because you had relaunched it.
I just did some digging. I went to the British Library. I read through old copies of Country Life.
Yeah.
They'd been a very highly regarded and obviously therefore highly written about in the days when there was very little written about anything by comparison to today's standards. But there were articles about them in the Times. There were multiple articles about them in Country Life and other magazines similar to that.
Right.
There were a couple of sort of in-depth features about them that included photographs of the shop and photographs of the cutting rooms and so on. So I also, they used to advertise quite a lot. So quite a few magazines, the sort of Country Life, The Field, The Queen, the Heart, like those magazines had classified sections in the back, and their adverts were quite big and quite detailed.
Okay.
And they included sort of descriptions of the various things they did, and in some of them they had little written sections where they talked about stuff. So, I was just piecing it together from publicly available information if you're prepared to go and dig for it. But the Churchill archive was a bit of luck. I wrote to the Churchill archive, and they sent me all of Churchill's bills, which detailed had complete breakdowns of everything he'd ever bought. So including things like cashmere racing breeches and jockey silks.
Wow. So this is the kind of folklore for me growing up. So this is from my mom's side. She's from Vancouver Island. They're all still over there except for my mom moved to the city with my dad. So Edward Tautz had a bunch of grandkids. In fact, he thought he had a lot of kids. He had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, just from his eldest son.
Yeah.
2 of his grandkids, George and Percival, married Now, this is a whole other story. Women from a hat making millinery, apparently a high fancy millinery. In fact, this is one of them. It looks like she's wearing a lampshade.
Oh, lovely. I mean, that would look lovely in the house.
Back in the day.
Yeah.
So the two brothers married two sisters. And they went to Vancouver. Weird. I don't know. Maybe it was something people did at the time. And they went to the most Canadian-sounding place on Vancouver Island called Maple Bay.
Oh, yeah, that is
and
Canadian
a beautiful place. I mean, this is just sort of interesting. This is Edward Tautz' grandson's passport that he used to get into Canada in 1901.
Oh, wow.
And the thing that maybe is the most interesting in a way, when they moved to Vancouver Island, they were remittance men, which I didn't know what this was, but basically you get checks in the mail every month and you just play badminton and live your life.
Right, okay.
And until, of course, everything kind of like the business closed up and whatever, and you know.
So they were living off dividends from the
exactly.
From the business.
They got money from the business, and they were living. There's two houses still there. They're not fancy houses, but little kind of Tudor-style houses near Maple Bay. My grandfather actually lives not in that area, but not far, 25 minutes away at this lake. But what's one of the most interesting ones, I won't go through the whole thing, but there's this letter sent to my grandfather's mom's brother. So there was the brother and the sister. So we're now like not that far down in 1950, basically stating there's no money left. the business shut down.
Interesting. What year was this?
So this is 1950, but it's talking about when the grandson, Arthur, the eldest grandson, who died in 1932, who would have been running it, I guess.
Yeah.
So it says, I deeply regret to say that I have very tragic facts to relate. As you already know, the majority of the small estate was in our family business, E. Tautz and Sons, of which my father was senior partner and trustee. So this person's writing about the eldest grandson. His death in 1932 disclosed a very serious financial position, and besides leaving several large and immediate debts, without outside assets sufficient to meet them, his capital in the business had also been very seriously depleted over a period of years. I will not dwell on this. It is sufficient for me to say that as a result, it was difficult to carry on the firm, and in spite of every endeavor, we were finally forced by trade creditors and the war into liquidation. So sometime between 1932 and this letter, 1950.
Because what I had understood, that is fascinating.
Isn't that crazy? There's probably more that are going to be dug up.
Also, I mean, there are several things that are fascinating. Firstly, that in a period of less than 70 years, they go from being one of the most celebrated brands in Europe to nothing. But of course, the First World War will have killed a huge percentage of their customers and changed the way people dressed quite considerably. And then the Second World War finished them off.
Yeah.
Post-war, post First World War, huge numbers of men die, and there are changes to the way everybody dresses and behaves, and the way that officers are clothed and that officer class dresses changes very dramatically. And the Second World War, of course, is a total nail in the coffin of anyone who's doing military clothing and sporting clothing. And Tautz were primarily a sporting tailors, but they also made military clothing as well. And that's the end. But when Norton's acquired it, it had obviously merged into a business called Hoare & Co.
And this was in the 60s or 70s?
Well, Norton's got it in the 60s.
Okay.
It had been merged, so obviously the people that were running Hoare & Co. were in a sort of, I guess they were in a similar position because they had been sporting and military tailors as well. So they were on their uppers. I guess they had acquired the Tautz name at around that time, and then Norton's acquired them both.
So that is really fascinating. They must have acquired it in this period we're talking about.
Period there, when
32 to 50. The other interesting thing is I just think of Downton Abbey or something like that. And obviously in Maple Bay, it was nowhere near that scope and scale. But what's interesting is my grandfather's mom, so it was her dad that was the grandkid, when he died, apparently the checks stopped coming.
Right.
And so they went from playing, badminton every day. And she was quite young when he died. I think she was 18 or something like that. Wow. She had to move to Victoria, which is the city. Yeah. And I don't know, work in a restaurant or something like that. It's kind of like just the complete change of...
Yeah. Well, it is. It's funny because Tautz originally set up in a shop, which I guess was something that they just rented or had acquired. But they then they moved down Oxford Street a short distance, but they built this palatial shop. I mean, when you see pictures of the shop that they built, it's grand. It is incredibly grand. You know, you've got this huge sweeping kind of staircase going up. You come in there are several photographs. I think it's in Country Life. There's an article about it. It shows you it all. But I mean, it's a big deal. I mean, it's not Selfridge's size, but it's
What's interesting is he was 50 when he started this company, because he was born in 1817, and was it 1867?
Yeah.
So it wasn't like he was just starting out.
No.
He was obviously well established.
He was what was known as the foreman at Hammond, which is the guy who ran the whole cutting room. So he was clearly. Also, it's relatively clear that he had a lot of ideas, and then when he set up Tautz, he is credited with inventing knickerbockers.
Yeah. Just so I know, what were they? Were they worn for riding, or were
they were sports? They were for sport.
With the sort of going out.
Yeah. And he fought. He obviously took legal action to secure his position as the founder of those, because there's reference to this legal case somewhere where he wins the right to claim that he is the inventor of the knickerbockers. But obviously Knickerbockers. The New York Knickerbockers, it's a name that's sort of forgotten. I'm now known as the Knicks, but it's
right. And but the word is everyone knows the word when you hear Knickerbockers.
Yeah, Knickerbocker glory. There is the other thing I think they're knickers. They are, they're pants. But they were sport. But they were making clothes for people who played golf, who rode bicycles. That's what they were designed as, a sportsman's trouser. In an era where, of course, people did sport in flannel trousers and tweed jackets, and people, but golfers picked them up, bicyclists picked them up, people who rode horses picked them up, people who shot picked them up. There's all sorts of things. So but he's obviously a real innovator with fabrics as well, because there's lots of mention of very specific waterproof meltons and other things. So he was clearly really a man who was sort of changing the face of sportswear in a really interesting way.
There was and then I just found out this part I didn't know until in the last couple months, was there was a store in Paris as well.
Yeah, there was a store in Paris, and I think the store in Paris was on the Rue Faubourg Saint-Honoré, opposite the Élysée Palace.
Do you know if the building is still there? Because obviously,
I don't know. I think I went and had a look. The building is gone on Oxford Street. I don't know. I can't.
There's a lot less.
Yeah, but I think there was also a store. Was there? Oh no, that was Hammond that had a store in Austria, in Vienna. But yes, no, they had this shop opposite the gates of the Élysée Palace, which again, obviously, was about as prestigious an address as you could possibly imagine.
It's just something funny because
this is like the Louis Vuitton.
I know. Well, it's just because when I think of my
actually they were about 2 doors down from Louis Vuitton.
Yeah.
Louis Vuitton now is worth 10 trillion squillion euros.
Yeah.
And poor old Tautz.
I feel like I'm on an episode of what's that? Who Do You Think You Are? Or whatever. And we're just going through the thing. It's really fascinating also because that's the folklore of that side of the family. But obviously that's so far removed, and they're so not that. They're very kind of working people, and my grandparents ran a diner for a long time.
But this is real sort of riches to rags, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a series in it where you kind of go like Downton Abbey upstairs.
Well, it's Mr. Selfridge, but gone bad.
Yeah. So I want to make sure we get into the book and everything, but we could just talk about this forever. It's most interesting probably just to my family. But tell me a bit about
the global audience for this is 4 people.
Yeah. Tell me we have a big family.
No, that's true. I mean, probably one of the biggest you've ever seen. Yeah.
So how did Tautz come into your life? You talk about it in the book. Can you just tell us a little bit about how? I love the story of you reading in the newspaper about this company that was for sale. But yeah, tell us how that sort of came to be.
Yeah, so I'd studied engineering. I worked in engineering for a number of years, and I'd always been much more interested in clothes and handmade stuff than I was interested in optical fibers and semiconductors, which was what I worked in. And I'd played with various things. I decided I was going to be an architect. So I got a place to study architecture. I went back and did A-level art and did all this stuff and got a place to study architecture. But then changed my mind. I was like, so a friend of mine actually had just graduated and his first job was designing the car parks for Iceland supermarkets. Okay. And I thought, what if I'm a shit
This
architect?
Is from the no, this is architecture.
Yeah,
not
this is architecture. This is,
okay.
a friend of mine. So I was like,
wow.
What if I go and study for 7 years and end up just doing that? Because I'd imagine myself as Mies van der Rohe or,
not
wherever Le Corbusier, but not the car park marker outer. So I sort of thought, I was like, oh God, it's too long. It's going to whatever. What if I'm not good at it? So, and also, the job I was doing, I was really enjoying. I was traveling all over the world doing interesting kind of infrastructure projects, building out, telecoms networks in South Africa and India and all sorts of interesting places, and traveling to the Seychelles and Nepal and all these amazing, all over. And it was fun. And I was like, right, okay, what if I'm... Anyway, then, the other thing I was really interested in architecture as a kid. And I was really interested in landscape gardening and gardening as a kid. My parents were all both mad gardeners. So I'd started volunteering for the National Trust, working at their gardens, doing these. You used to be able to do these amazing working holidays where you paid the National Trust to go and basically work on one of their estates. You paid almost nothing, but you got your food and board, and you would go and work with the head gardener or the estate manager and build paths or rebuild bits of gardens or just go and work in a garden. So I thought, look, this is amazing. I love doing this. I'm going to be a landscape gardener. And I'd worked as a landscape gardener during the nearly 2 years that I was traveling in the States. I worked as a landscape gardener in Colorado. So I thought I'm going to do this. And again, got a place to go on.
How old are you at this point?
Mid-20s.
Okay.
But then the salary was so bad as a trainee. I think it was an $8,000 a year training salary. And then a starting salary of 12 grand. And by this stage, I was already on multiples of that working in engineering. I'm like, I'm going to be absolutely broke. Like, what if I get pitched into a National Trust garden down the bottom end of Cornwall or in the middle of that? I'm never going to be able to afford to get to see anybody, and I was quite sociable, but I was like, this could be bad. Anyway, then I read an article in the paper, actually in the FT, about MBAs. I thought this is a really interesting way to learn a load of interesting stuff and get opportunities to find out about lots and lots of different areas that I could work in. So I went and did this MBA. And while I was there, I was supposed to be having lunch with a good friend of mine. And he messaged to say he couldn't make it. So I had lunch on my own, and it was quite late. And all the papers had been nicked apart from one, which was the FT. So I sat in the amazing dining hall at my college, and sort of Harry Potter amazing Hogwarts dining hall. I think it actually is in it is in Harry Potter.
Where is which schools?
This is at New College.
Oh yeah.
So I didn't really normally read the FT, even though I was studying for a business degree.
Okay.
Probably should have done. But I certainly had never, ever seen or read the businesses for sale section. Yeah. So on that one day, there was a tiny postage stamp sized advert that said, for sale, tailor to kings, emperors and presidents or whatever. Write to Mr. N. Granger at 16 Savile Row. And I thought, is that a Savile Row tailor for sale on the back of the paper? And I sort of couldn't believe it. So I wrote to them.
And what was your connection, to was there a connection to Savile Row?
There was no connection.
Or you just liked
I loved
clothes,
Savile Row.
you
I
loved
loved clothes, I loved
But there wasn't like a
handmaking.
dream of I want to work there one day, I want to do this,
I was supposed
to.
I mean, the firm that I worked for had paid for my MBA, and I was supposed to go back and work for them when I was finished. And
okay.
I wasn't supposed to be sodding off and buying a 200-year-old tailoring house.
So you just rung them up?
I wrote him a letter, and he sent me some stuff back. He sent me back this memorandum of sort of information that looked like he'd done it on clip art.
So now are you in your 30s at this point?
Now I'm in early 30s.
Because did he take you seriously? I mean, here's someone studying their MBA going, I want to buy this.
He did, yeah. Well, wow. I mean, he did take me seriously. And apparently there were two other quite serious I mean, I don't know how much of this is true. In fact, I should probably go back and check with him. But there were there was one other very well-known brand that apparently was interested in buying it. But he liked me. We got on well. I loved what it was all about and wanted to try and return it to its sort of proper state. It had fallen down because they'd had a little licensing agreement with Japan to make some tailored clothes and shirts and ties in Japan. And the department store that they'd had that agreement with had gone bust in the Japanese recession, sort of 2002. And so the loss of that income had sort of crippled them because the guy who was running it at the time, his dad had been the head cutter. His dad had been the one who bought Tautz and Hoare.
Oh, wow. Okay.
In the 60s. And then he'd taken over the Norton business from the Norton family, run it very successfully, had a house on Sloane Square, had a house in Connecticut, had a house in Gloucestershire, was making an awful lot of money. He retired, sold the business to his sons, and they ran it. One each of them ran it for a sort of 7-year period each. But then the latter son, it definitely wasn't busting his hump. You know, he was commuting in from Gloucestershire, first class on the train, couple of days a week, you know, having a nice time, going away. And that was all grand while the Japanese license was pumping money into the business. But when that went, it wasn't sustainable at all. And so I bought it in a condition it was in a voluntary arrangement with the receivers. So they were unable to pay their bills properly at the time. And you know, we came to an agreement, and he did take me seriously, and he liked me because he liked that I was going to keep running it as a bespoke tailor's and not try and do something else with it. So we agreed on a price, and I sold my house and everything else and raised some money and borrowed money from my lovely granny and a couple of old friends from university and one of the guys the year below me at Oxford and, you know, a whole bunch of people. And we bought it.
But what I found really interesting about this is, so you're in your early 30s and you're asking all these people, you're selling your house and asking people to borrow money and stuff like that. Had you run a business before? Was there evidence that, like, how?
I'd run. So in the job that I'd just come from, I had actually I'd run a division of this bigger business. I was responsible for the profit and loss of this chunk of our business that was a sort of product group within Bookham's business. So I knew, you know, and I'd managed quite a big team of engineers and scientists and salespeople and stuff. Okay. So I'd some experience of managing the profit and loss of a small bit of a business.
How confident were you that it was going to go well?
Entirely confident.
Really?
I had no doubt in my head that it was going to be successful. Probably foolishly.
But that's probably the only way to do it.
I think that is the thing. I think if you are an entrepreneurial person, you know, I think it's sometimes interesting for, obviously, people who are entrepreneurial know what it feels like to be an entrepreneurial person. You have total faith that the thing that you are about to embark on is going to be successful. You can you can visualize what it's going to be, and then all you have to do is take the small steps that get you from where it is. And in the case of Norton's, it was already an existing business. It was just in a bad way. It just needed to be sort of channeled back to goodness. In the case, obviously, later of Community Clothing, it was something that didn't exist. But again, in my mind's eye, I could see the entire ecosystem of this business in the future. And then, you know, that's what you do as an entrepreneur. You can visualize the business that you want to create, and then you have to drag a load of other people in that direction and make it real. You are creating something out of nothing, but you have to be able to see it. And people who are entrepreneurial can see it. And it was weird. I was having a conversation with someone and it was like totally baffled by the idea of being able to imagine a whole company that doesn't exist.
Were there other firms that on Savile Row that were successful? The reason I asked was I was thinking the one thing, even though it was a business that existed when you bought it, it's not exactly the most popular model for clothing now? I mean, it's a very niche thing. It seems like very specific thing.
It's a very, very niche and very specific thing. I mean, I think interestingly, it is a model that actually works for the future because it is a model that is very low impact on the planet. It is effectively almost zero waste. It is producing product that is very carefully chosen because it's very expensive and you wouldn't just on a whim go and, blow $7,000.
And there's a whole process, right?
There's a whole process you have to go through. But also, we're not encouraging you to buy stuff you don't need. The tailors on Savile Row aren't out there going, here's 500 new things you need this season. It's like, we got some new cloth. If you want to have a look, it's over there. Yeah. The great problem in our industry now is that most of the big businesses in the fashion world, which goes all the way down to the fast fashion rubbish, can only exist if they are continually able to encourage you to buy more things that you don't need.
Yeah.
Which is clearly a totally terrible business model for everyone apart from the people whose money is in it and who stand to gain financially, because it's terrible for the planet, it's terrible for the consumer, it's terrible for all the people that make it. It's an absolutely valueless system that's doing tons of harm and does nobody any good apart from, the one guy at the top who's sitting on a mega yacht. But the tailor's model, and it's also the model that we use in community clothing, is like sell people what they need, make it as well as you possibly can so that it lasts forever, help people fix it, encourage them to keep it for a long time, and then allow them to pass it on to the next generation by altering it and refitting it so that it works for another 50 years. I mean, it's a beautiful model that works. It's just that in the world of Savile Row, it's eye-wateringly expensive. But we've tried to replicate that sense of not driving unnecessary consumption in community clothing. And I think the world needs business models that are like that can exist. All of those tailors have worked perfectly happily for, in some cases, 200 plus years. In the case of Norton's, a little over 200 years. In the case of many of my neighbors around about the same time without ever having to get bigger.
Yeah.
We live in a world that's sort of hooked on the idea that growth is a necessity in business, and actually it's not true. I don't think we need degrowth either necessarily, but it's perfectly legitimate to be the size you are as long as everybody who is involved in that business, the suppliers, the employees, the customers, are happy with the financial arrangement as it stands. Status quo is fine. Like, we don't need to get bigger. And all of those businesses existed extremely happily. And in the 20 years that I ran Norton's, we stayed roughly the same size, but we were always a little bit profitable. Everybody got paid. Everybody, all of the staff were well paid. All the suppliers were well paid. Everybody enjoyed, the customers loved the product. It was really interesting to me to think about, what is on the face of it, a slightly arcane model, but it is in fact entirely future-proof.
So so we've slid into talking about less, which I'm happy about because I want to dive into this, into your fantastic book. But the thing that when I came to visit Norton & Sons on Savile Row, what struck me, because I didn't know anything about Savile Row being from Canada, I just knew this was a street, and I thought they were shops. And the thing that I walked in, you wouldn't call it a shop, would you?
Well, there's a shop. There's a shop bit at the front. You do talk a tailor's shop, but there is the workshop is there.
Well, the thing that I loved,
we are making the stuff.
So I didn't know that. I just thought you were in the back having a coffee or something when you came out. But the thing that struck me was there wasn't really much on display. No. So you were talking about the sort of, we're going to sell you the latest, hottest new thing. It wasn't in your face. So tell me about when the seeds for the ideas within the book when they started to come up, when you started thinking there's a book in this. Was it through looking at the model of Savile Row? Had you been thinking about it before in terms of...
In 2015, I bought one of the suppliers to Tautz. So the two most successful products we ever did for Tautz were a pair of trousers called the Field Trousers, which I'm wearing today, although these are community clothing's version of them, which are exactly the same factory, same fabric, same everything else, just different price point, and a shirt called the Lineman shirt. So there were two products that were spectacularly successful. Year after year after year, we sold loads of them. So this is, we would sell them to 60 odd stores, lots of them in Japan. These were mega popular in Japan. Lots and lots of very cool people wearing these trousers in Japan. And they sort of, they achieved a slightly sort of iconic status amongst sort of cool people in Japan, which was really nice. They were made in a factory in Blackburn called Cookson and Clegg. Cookson and Clegg was owned by a big fabric producer who supplied almost all of the army's camo, a lot of the NHS's fabric for nurses and doctors' scrubs, supplied fabric to police forces and all that. Anyway, big textile group. They had owned Cookson's. Cookson's had been a military clothing supplier from the 1930s until 2009. 2009 British military contracts all disappear offshore for the production of clothing. And so they've lost most of their business overnight. They attempt to kind of reposition the factory making for sort of high-end brands. Doesn't really work. And in 2015, they write to us and say, we're going to shut the factory down. I wrote back, emailed back and said, can we talk about this urgently, please? Short conversation. The upshot was, if we could buy the business, we could keep it alive. If not, it was being shut. So that's what we did. So I bought Cookson and Clegg in 2015, and then I set about thinking about how to preserve Cookson's and lots of other factories in the UK that we worked with through Tautz. And the idea that I came up with was the idea behind community clothing. But in thinking about that, I'm thinking not just let's start a clothing brand. I'm thinking, how can we build a model for clothing that works for all of these suppliers, works for the customer, and is future-proof? And thinking about that, I'm thinking about the way that Norton's is run, thinking about the way that clothing businesses used to be run, thinking about the point that sort of clothing and fashion diverged, and thinking about the idea that in the past people used to have there used to be clothing businesses and fashion businesses, and today there are only fashion businesses. Almost nobody does clothing. There are a very small handful of people who would call themselves clothiers. Almost everybody is a fashion brand. And that change, I feel, was very, very detrimental to all of us, because we all need clothes. There's basic stuff. Most people's wardrobes will consist of a percentage of clothing and a percentage of fashion. If you're a real fashion-forward person, you might have 10% clothes, 90% fashion. I'm probably the other way around. I wear clothes. I don't really buy fashion at all anymore. But almost every business on the planet had moved away from clothing. And I'm like, clothing actually is good. Fashion is emotional manipulation. It's exploitation of workers and others all the way along the chain. It's low value, high volume, low quality. It's awful. Clothing is high value, low volume, care, consideration, cherishing pieces for a long time. It's quality. And I think thinking about all of that in the process of thinking about creating community clothing started me into the whole thinking behind the philosophy of this book. Launching community clothing, I started having conversations with lots of people about the idea behind, the general philosophy behind community clothing is really the general philosophy behind less. Have fewer things but better things, and buy things where the people that are involved in its production and its making and its end of life and all the rest of it are all benefiting from it. This is going back to a model of business that benefits everybody that's involved, not the current model of business where the only beneficiaries, I feel, are that one person that owns it all. I mean, there are at the sort of luxury end of the fashion world, there are certainly lots of brands up there who pay their suppliers well, who make things in a good way, who still work with good materials, where the weavers and the spinners and the lace makers and the tanners and all the rest of it are getting properly paid. And in some cases, in the cases of people like Chanel and others, they've had to buy their suppliers to enable them to continue to do things in a really good way. So, hats off to those guys. But that's where it all started. And then, of course, when I started writing the book, I would have conversations with people about writing the book, and they'd say, oh, well, have you read such and such? And I'd say, no, what's that about? And they'd tell me, and I'm like, oh, God, I'm going to have to read that. And then this happened repeatedly. So between the September and January I've got the books on the bookshelf, not including the ones that I got from the library. It's about that much of books. And, lots of social and economic history, lots of economic history, lots of business history, lots and lots of history.
You start the book, one of the things, it reminds me a little bit of Sapiens. Have you read that book?
I have read that book,
In the sense, one of my favorite books.
It's brilliant,
In the sense that you start the two big kind of themes in the beginning. Well, the one is you talk about happiness, and then you really start from the beginning. I mean, there's a quote. There's a quote that I love.
Well, I wanted to, because at each point I was like, how far back do we go? Well, we've got to go right back to the start.
Well, this is what I was going to ask, but let me just read this quote, which is, "We know from the DNA of human-dwelling fleas that we've been wearing clothes since the latter part of the Paleolithic period." So this book begins kind of there.
Yeah.
Why did you want to start there?
Well, because I think it's really, really instructive. I think because we can learn bits from different periods that point to a direction that we ought to try and move forward to. Don't move back to it, but move forward to it. And I think it's really, really fascinating, because every time I was sort of like, how do I explain how we get to Shein? Well, then we've got to explain how we got to ASOS. Well, then we've got to explain how we got to kind of Zara and Primark. And then we have to explain how we get to the idea of ready-to-wear fashion and, Saint Laurent, Rive Gauche. Well, then you've got to explain how we get to fashion, the idea of fashion in clothing, which is Charles Worth. Well, how do we get to the idea of fashion as an idea? Deliberately creating new things to encourage people to buy stuff they don't need. Well, then, so you've got to look back at, the sort of mid-18th century and Wedgwood and the furniture makers.
Yeah.
Well, how do we get to them? What led us to the point where we sort of, what needed to make that change? Well, so how did we go from being a non-consumer society to a consumer society? How do we get to being, an industrialized? I mean, you work your way all the way back through, and it's like, well, it isn't enough just to start here. I think it's much easier to follow the narrative of how we went from, the birth of the consumer age to this ridiculous period where, we're making bazillions of things and they're all rubbish. Starting right back at the beginning. You don't spend too long back there because there isn't too much to say. But, there is I think it's interesting to point to man's natural inclinations. And our natural inclinations are to try to make things incredibly well. Because in the beginning, literally, our lives depended on it.
Yeah.
If we made terrible clothes, we'd freeze to death. If we made terrible tools, we wouldn't be able to kill things and eat things. So literally, our lives depended. So there was an inherent human propensity to make things really, really well. For a very, very long time, we naturally tried to make things better and better and better and better. And all of our advances over the course of about 35,000 years were make things better and better and better and better. And, there was also a natural human desire to keep things and fix things because things were valuable. We valued objects. We valued the people that made those objects. And all of that is natural and human. And it is only at the start of the era of fashion that we switch that narrative. And even then, we're still making good things. And then there's a point when big capital gets involved and they're like, stop making things well, make things cheaper. So all of that 30-odd thousand years of constantly striving to make things better, we have to artificially reverse that because we're now being told we have to make things cheaper and cheaper. And also as human beings, we're now told it's not good to keep things and cherish them and look after them.
Yeah.
What you have to do is buy new ones all the time.
Buy the next
and
model.
Both of those things are not natural. And it is part of the reason why we don't feel happy with them, because in the back of our heads, we kind of know it's wrong. We're being deliberately manipulated into this state of mind where we have to buy new stuff to feel like good people. And it's creating huge levels of anxiety. And we know that happiness is going down. And I think only by going back to the very beginning and highlighting the fact that this is not a natural way for us to want to live, can you kind of explain why we feel so bad about it now.
Well, and you explain from, the age of hunters, shepherds, agriculture, commerce, and it's really, really interesting. It's just in the beginning of the book, and then you get to this major irrevocable moment kind of 300 years ago of consumerism emerging. And I mean, I was just thinking as you were saying that I never buy the latest iPhone, for example. I always buy like 5 models old or whatever and keep it as long as I can. But there's a little part of me that's like, I'm not quite as, hot or good because of that. There is that kind of voice. But you talk about...
Well, I mean, it's everywhere. You get in the tube the other week and I'm like, there are there's every sign in the whole tube was like, buy the latest iPhone. I'm like, you told me 6 months ago that the one that you were selling me then was the best thing that it was going to change my life and be amazing. Why 6 months later is that now a piece of shit? And this is the thing I need to buy.
So
we're done with it. I mean, I think there is a growing feeling that literally they're just pulling our pants down here.
Okay, I love this quote. I'm going to read it to you, and then it's the sort of the section that I think carries us forward in terms of what we need to do. So you say, clothes have power. They form part of our memory of events in our lives. We become so intimately connected with good quality clothes over long years, we wear them. And in the not too distant past, we believe that some of our soul would pass into them. For this reason, people would place an old shoe into a wall or under a floor of a newly built house because they believe that our spirit held within the shoe would bring the house good luck. We remember special outfits, graduation suits, wedding frocks. They can take us back to places we have been and help us recall the people we passed our time with. I thought it was a great... First of all, I'd love to buy an old house and find a shoe in the wall. But tell me why the story and the connection is kind of the way forward, or so much of this book I feel like is about the story, the connection, who's owned it before, all of that.
I think again, there is a natural inclination within us to enjoy the storytelling in things. And I think to enjoy the human connections that physical objects bring us and remind us of. I love that story. I didn't know that story of the shoe. I did an event with Salisbury Museum, and one of the curators there, it was about old clothes. It was an exhibition about old clothes, and the curator there told me the story, and then somebody else told me the story again like 2 months later. But I'd never heard it before, and I thought it was lovely. But this, clothes do become. I mean, there are stories in clothes. Good objects have stories from their very beginning, because you've got. It can be the story of the creation of the material. There are now a good handful of brilliant woodworkers who are working with, known trees. You have a tree that blows down in your garden. Instead of chopping it up and turning it into firewood, which would be the way that the modern world would have you do it, we are now relearning the skills to be able to work with found wood in the ways that we always used to, and transform that into something useful. So, back to this, we're working with a spinner who's working with sheep from the hillsides that are near where I live. So the connection to the land, either, through the materials that are grown there, or, the livestock that live there that we get fibers from. Or it might be that the clay is dug in this place, or whatever it happens to be. We've mined this copper here. We can, there is a connection where we understand the materials. I mean, obviously, most of the things we buy today, I'm sitting on a chair that's almost certainly the covering is made out of oil. Like, there's no romance to, Exxon drilling oil out the bottom of the sea somewhere and some giant chemical works turning it into plastic. But there is a romance to most natural materials, and then there is a romance to the way those are processed. All of those various actors. I had a meeting with a blacksmith the other day to talk about fixing the railings at my house, that very derelict house that I bought. The railings, the gates will fall down, but he's like, these are made out of cast iron, and because they're cast iron, not steel, they're still alive. If you'd made them out of a different material, they'd have gone by now. They'd have rusted and disappeared. But there's something elemental about that process of working with materials that gives the firstly, if you are an individual maker making something, there is a really strong incentive for you to do it really well. If you are a nameless factory working as a subcontractor for another nameless factory working for a brand, there's no love, there's no incentive to do a really good job. But where you've got very visible actors working to make something, they each are required to do their best, and they also want to do their best because their personal reputation is linked to it. And again, the person that bought it for you, or the person that made it for you. All of these things give meaning to objects that increase our happiness in them. And you find that, the things that I cherish most are usually things that I've either had for a very long time or have been handed down to me from father, grandfather, grandmother, whether it's furniture, bits of clothes, whatever. Those things have real meaning because of where they've come from and the connections I feel. There's a tie of my dad's that I still wear quite frequently. And the thing with ties is if you've tied them year after year after year in a certain way, the silk becomes formed in such a way that you can't actually tie it any other way. And I do tie the same tie knot that my dad ties, quite a small 4-in-hand. And when I put that tie on, it only ties one way. So I know that this is where my dad's hands have sat. Yeah. And I can, almost feel his presence in this object. And it's a really lovely thing. And if you live in a world of disposable stuff, you get none of that. You get none of that emotional attachment to things. They don't have the time to develop it. They don't have the innate physical quality to develop those patinas. And, it's like old shoes, bits of, furniture that have been, you can feel where somebody's bum has worn away the seat of an old Windsor chair. Yeah. Those things are lovely. Those connections are the things that make us incredibly happy and bring richness to our life. None of this disposable stuff gives us that.
And I have like a bureau writing, those desks that come out. And I moved here from Canada, so I didn't have any furniture or things. I basically had nothing. But I've always wanted one of these. We call them secretary desks in Canada.
Or secretary.
Yeah, I always wanted one of these since I was a kid. So I bought one online, and it was somebody's grandfather's of something. And you can, even though I don't have a personal connection to the people, I can tell there's all these hidden drawers, like little things that you wouldn't even realize. And there's something really beautiful.
But there's also just a feel to, the polish on a knob that's been, those drawer pulls that have been pulled 1,000 times. It's the same with steps. The steps at Norton & Sons are stone steps and they're sort of worn away. That gives something a value and a beauty that, a square concrete step has none of.
When I think about when I direct plays and do theater in my other life, I think a lot about the sort of ritual and the inner purpose behind these acts of people coming together for a story. The point of a ritual being to replicate the thing that has been done through history, so you're connected to that original act. I'm going to drink the blood of Christ or whatever, and now there's a feeling of connection to something greater than yourself. I think what you're saying about the knob and you can feel that it's been worn down and it's smooth and everybody, all these different people have touched it and used it and it's been a part of their lives. And there's a connection to something greater in that, which is beautiful. I just want to ask you one more question because we're at our time. So thank you so much for doing this. Really, really interesting. We could go on forever. But before I ask you the last question, how can people find out more about you? You've got community clothing. I've heard there's a newsletter. Community clothing. What's the best way to sort of keep up to date with?
Well, what we're thinking and doing. Yeah, the community clothing newsletter. You don't need to be a customer of community clothing to sign up to the newsletter. We know that there are quite a few people, in fact, a few tens of thousands of people who sign up to the newsletter just to read our ramblings on things. But it's all about the world that we think we should be building. We think that business. I think that business has the power to do extraordinary good for people, for communities, for the customers, by doing things in a way that makes everybody feel good about it. And, everything we do is around trying to build the best clothing business that we can. And, so the newsletter is about all sorts of stuff. I mean, this week, I'm doing a talk with a lady called Celia Pym who's a brilliant darner, and a lady called Helen Kirkham who makes very desirable shoes out of old trainers. She deconstructs them and makes something new out of them. Like that. So, next week's newsletter will be talking about how lovely it feels to fix things and bring things back to life and create new things from old things. And
so it's not the latest sale.
There is never a sale.
I know, that's why I said that.
Yeah. But it is we're not selling you anything. I mean, we do use the newsletter to inform people of things that have come back into stock or new things that we think people might be interested in. We're going to be launching kids wear in 6 or 7 weeks' time. So, we will talk about the kids wear, and we'll talk about why we've done it and how we've done it and where it's sourced and why we've decided to do it with no plastics and, the lovely illustrator that we're working with on all the kind of characters for the kids wear and all that stuff. We'll talk about that stuff. But, I know, because people tell me, which is nice, that people like reading the newsletter. It could be a page from the book. It's trying to encourage people to think differently about the clothes that they buy, and therefore not necessarily, but hopefully consequently about the other things that they might buy. Be more considered, think about where your money goes, and think about the impact that everything that you're doing and buying has on everybody else. And so you can read that. I'm on Instagram, but I'm not madly, I'm on there. I do a column for the FT, which I love doing.
Oh, nice.
I do
How often?
Monthly.
Okay.
Which is about restoring my garden, but always doing it in a way. Again, it's a sort of celebration of people who do things really well. So it's sort of I've done everything from learning how to scythe to having pigs to clear the bad stuff instead of using chemicals, to bird boxes, to there'll be a blacksmith one. The next one, I think there's croquet lawns and badminton.
I mean, I found it really interesting in the book how one of the things you mentioned is that now sort of the more wealthy or privileged or people who have the ability to do this and who are having mental health issues are often prescribed, nature or crafts or making or things like that.
Yeah, it's funny. It's a lovely phenomenon, but it's really dark.
Coming back full circle.
Yeah, exactly.
Second to last question. How do you play whistle and bar? Because you mention it in this book. You mention it in the new book.
Yeah.
And I need to know because I like to give the listeners interesting, fun games
Whistle and bar. So, I mean, I can't really give it, because it's been a while since I've played whistle and bar, I can't really give you some brilliant examples. But if the idea with whistle and bar is if somebody says something that can be construed as an insult. Okay. I mean, either an insult, it could be a straight insult, or even something that you could construe as being an insult. Anybody else in the workroom can whistle it. Oh. And then that insult goes back to you. So if you say something that is an insult, you have to bar that insult. Or if you say something that you instantly recognize could be construed as an insult, you have to bar it as well. So you can bar at the beginning or the end. So you say, barring that so-and-so's a right lazy git.
Right.
And then I can't whistle it. But if you say, oh, that so-and-so's a right lazy git, and I whistle it before you bar it, goes back to you. That's whistle and bar.
Okay, I love it.
Some people are so advanced that they will find brilliant, hidden insults in otherwise perfectly innocent statements that people make. Then they get whistled, and then it's like, way,
I looked it up because it's mentioned in this book and your other book, and I couldn't find any information. And I
don't think it's played as much as it used to be, but there were certain people who were genius at it, because it's one of those things. The tailors are sewing.
Yeah,
they're sewing or they're cutting, but they're talking because they're so good. The hands are working and the brain can be doing something else.
I have a book on old Victorian parlor games that I love, and I often just dig through it for, again, these are just ways we can find connection and have fun where we're not showing somebody a TikTok reel or whatever. Yeah. Which leads me to my last question. So we have a segment called Parish Notices, which is simply how are you fostering a sense of connection and community recently in the last few weeks or coming up? Is there anything specific that you can share with us?
Well, I mean, I live in the Yorkshire Dales. I live on the very edge of the Yorkshire Dales National Park, at the boundary between the Yorkshire Dales National Park and the Forest of Bowland National Landscape. There's a couple of things that I'm doing. Wildlife is really important to me. So I had a meeting at the weekend with a couple of ladies from the Curlew Action Group.
What's curlew?
A curlew is a very rare wading bird that comes and nests, but it nests, one of the areas it nests in is the Forest of Bowland and the edge of the Dales. It nests on the ground in marshy pasture land, and it's becoming it's endangered. Now there's a scheme that pays farmers to protect nests. So you have to, if you find a nest or you're aware of a nest on your land, you can fence it off and the Colo Action Group compensates you about 500 quid for the loss of income from that sort of acre of land that you have to put around. You have to put little solar-powered electric fences that go around that stop the foxes and the badgers and the sheep from trampling over the nests. Sheep will eat the eggs as well, amazingly. So that, and then I work with... I've got this really, really sweet letter. I did a talk at Blackburn Cathedral the other day, and a lady from the Craven Wildlife Rescue brought me a little handwritten letter, which I follow Craven Wildlife Rescue, and it's lovely, and it saves hedgehogs and barn owls and all sorts of gorgeous stuff. And this letter very sweetly asked if I, might be interested to sort of help what they do. So my parish notices are, I will be doing all I can to help fund and promote the activities of my local wildlife groups, the Colo Action Group and the Craven Wildlife Rescue. You can support Craven Wildlife Rescue, I suspect, through their Instagram account.
Fantastic.
I probably should know more than that, but there we are.
That's great.
What I love
We'll put
doing.
everything in the show notes, including the book, community clothing, and all of that. People want to check it out. And also, you have a new book. When does that come out? It's called The Savile Row Suit. Is it
that
out?
is out.
It's out.
Yeah.
It looks beautiful.
Yeah, it's lovely.
Oh my
It's,
God,
again,
it
it was sort of
looks
20
stunning.
years of working on Savile Row. We'd always actually intended to write a book that documents the craft of bespoke tailoring, and it was such a huge amount of work. We had planned to do it for Norton's 200th anniversary. Then COVID hit, but we got round to it eventually. In fact, one of the tailors that helped me write it, Rachel, was like, we've been talking about this for about 8 years. I'm like, okay, yeah, I hadn't remembered it was quite that long. But yeah, it's a lovely book. So it's part of the story of Savile Row and Norton's and my little story on Savile Row, my 20 years, but also it's a very, very detailed, totally detailed, step-by-step instructional on how to make jacket, trousers, waistcoat, and a shirt.
Yeah, and there's beautiful images and illustrations.
Yeah, it was lovely. It was a lovely, lovely thing to do. It was an extraordinary amount of work, and I can understand why nobody's ever done it before. But it is the only fully detailed. If you want to learn to do this without doing a 5-year apprenticeship, you can.
That's where you start. Yeah, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolute pleasure. Really enjoyed it.
Really great. Yeah.
When the bells ring out across the big smoke, we like to hear how you are fostering connection and community. So we sent out our correspondent Ahmed to find out.
Hey, it's Ahmed here with your latest Parish Notices. But before we dive into them, I've got mine as well. This week, I went to an exhibition where I met with amazing artists, and I was there chatting like a pro. Actually, one of them thought I was an artist, so I just laughed because honestly, let me tell you something, because if I ever draw something, I would be the only person who understands what it is, because you can't understand, only me. But another one said, you know what, you don't have to be great to start something. And that got me thinking. I was like, you know what, perhaps it's time for me to pick up a pencil and try something out. Now it's time to hear some of yours. Let's go.
Hi, my name's Lorato, and my parish notice is all about teaching. I'm an English teacher in community centers and libraries, and I love my job. It allows me to meet people from all over the world, learn so much about new cultures, and discover new foods and new traditions, all while helping people settle into their new communities. I feel so lucky to have the job that I have.
Hello, I am Jasmine Kondonikolaou. I am partly Greek, partly Danish, living in Greece. My parish notice is about going to the gym, though I'm not the most social person in general, but I tend to be more talkative when I meet people who share my interests. The gym is one of those spaces where I naturally open up and start conversations, especially during push-ups, not pull-ups. Still working on that. Personally, the gym isn't just a place to work out, but it's much more a place where you can connect with others and share your interests, and in general, grow your community.
Hi, I'm Katya from London, and my parish notice is all about theatre and school. Theatre isn't just about performing. It is a way to connect with others and build a strong, supported community while you're having so much fun. Both in theatre and school, you get to express yourself every single day, unlocking creativity, confidence, and personal growth. It is all about stepping into new opportunities and embracing everything life has to offer.
Hiya, Vasa here, a Greek girl living in Nottingham. My parish notice is about the amazing world of social dance. It's the easiest and most joyful ways to connect with people from all walks of life, different ages, backgrounds, and genders, all brought together by a shared passion for dance. The best part is that all it takes is asking somebody to dance. Before you know it, not only have you had a great time, but you've also made a friend for life in this pretty incredible community. So if you've ever thought about trying it, go for it. You never know where one dance might lead.
Hi, I'm Michelina from Manchester, and my parish notice is going to the park, where I can meet so many different people. It can be anything from just sharing a smile with a stranger to a whole new chat with someone new. It's amazing getting to know people in the community and hearing different stories from people who we'd usually just pass by. Sometimes just asking how your day is going can open up the door to such a beautiful conversation, and I really enjoy it.
Granny's costume trunk. When I was a kid, there were no smartphones pulling us into their glow. The only screen time we had was on a fake wood-paneled television with 13 channels, none of them particularly addictive. But whenever we visited my mum's parents on Vancouver Island, there was no need for screens. There was too much to explore. They ran a restaurant and marina on a lake. Old boats bobbed at the docks, waiting to be rented by summer adventurers. Seaplanes swooped in to refuel. Families stopped at the Galley Marina for burgers, fries, and ice cream before heading back out onto the water. My grandparents were like the unofficial mayors of Shawnigan Lake. But that's a story for another time. Their house sat across the street from the restaurant. A big old house overlooking all the lake activity, filled with the treasures they collected over the years. Quirky thrift store finds, creaky floorboards, and a mean old cat who would swipe at you if you got too close. In the living room sat an organ that no one could really play properly, though we all tried, its deep, haunting notes adding to the house's eclectic charm. And upstairs, beneath the slanted ceiling of a spare room, sat the trunk. Large and weathered, the kind you'd imagine brought on an ocean crossing in another century, it felt like a portal to another world. Inside, it was brimming with possibility, costumes, old clothes, odd bits and pieces. Where had they come from? Thrift store scavenges, long-forgotten Halloween costumes, special occasions now lost to time? It didn't matter, because the moment we were given permission to open it, my brother and I would run up those creaky stairs, lift open the lid, and dive in. The best part was the transformation. A wig first, a pair of oversized glasses, a long frilly dress that instantly turned me into someone older, someone grander, someone from another era? What character would I build from the things I unearthed that day? The trunk never seemed to run out of new combinations, new ways to become something or someone else. Dressing up was my favorite thing in the world. There are photos of me in wigs and oversized high heels from before I can even remember. Lost in the joy of make-believe. Time stood still when I played dress-up, yet it also slipped away too quickly. Well, about 30 years have slipped by, and admittedly, I don't dress up much anymore. I think I am always searching for ways to return to that place, to dig into a metaphorical trunk and let myself get lost in the world of possibility. In Thornton Wilder's iconic 1938 play Our Town, the character Emily asks, "Do any human beings ever realize life while they live it? Every minute?" As children, in a way we did. In the act of playing, imagining, and becoming, we were fully present. No past, no future, just that moment. Of course, we can't live like that always. Life moves forward, responsibilities take hold. But maybe that's why I still search for my grandmother's costume trunk in different ways. Not a treasure chest filled with costumes, but anything that reminds me of the infinite worlds waiting just beyond the edges of life's routines. At the end of that play, Our Town, there's a character called the stage manager who looks up at the night sky and wonders to the audience, out there in the dark, the stars are doing their old crisscross journeys in the sky. Scholars haven't settled the matter yet, but they seem to think there's no living beings up there. Just chalk or fire. Only this one is straining away all the time to make something of itself. The strain's so bad that every 16 hours everybody lies down and gets a rest. Maybe that's what the trunk was. Its own tiny universe, filled with endless paths to travel, countless selves to try on, and a gentle reminder that, like those stars, we are always straining towards something, towards purpose, towards meaning. The trunk let me slip into different selves for a little while, but maybe it was never really about becoming someone else. Maybe it was about glimpsing something infinite inside myself. Oh, you know what that means? It's now time for Archie's Neuro Nuggets. Quick, actionable insights inspired by the emerging field of neuroaesthetics.
Hello, Big Smoke listeners. My name is Archie McAlpine. I am an interdisciplinary specialist in the wellbeing space. I studied biomedical science and then a master's in neuroaesthetics, the newest branch of neuroscience, which explores how our brains respond to the arts and to our environments. So this week we're going to talk about fractals in nature and alpha waves. Patterns in nature, called fractals, trigger alpha waves in the brain, linked to relaxation and creativity. Fractal patterns follow the Fibonacci series, which we see in maths. It's a pattern where each element in the sequence is the sum of the two elements that precede it. So it goes like 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, etc. And if you display it visually, you see a perfect spiral pattern. So here's how it works. Looking at things like tree branches, waves, or clouds naturally lowers stress by 60%. Museums and architects nowadays use fractals to create calming spaces. Now try this at home. Go on awe walks in nature without your phone. Look at leaves, trees, or ripples in water. Notice if it makes you feel relaxed or focused. Alternatively, you can set fractal wallpapers on your phone for a quick stress hack.
Thanks for that, Archie. I've never heard of fractals, but I'm definitely going to go for an awe walk without my phone in the park later today. You can find out more about Archie and his work in the show notes. All right, time to find out if you stumped the room. Let's reveal those answers. First up, I asked, the word tailor comes from the French word tailler. What does it mean? If you guessed to cut, well done! The term dates back to the 13th century when a new style of garment making emerged, emphasizing precise cutting and shaping of fabric. Next, we talked about a term that became closely linked to Savile Row's master tailors. Originally, the word bespoke meant to order or arrange in advance. But in the world of tailoring, what did it specifically refer to? The answer is fabric that was spoken for by a particular client. Meaning, once a customer claimed a piece of cloth, it was reserved exclusively for them. And finally, in 1840, when Edward Tautz was just 23, Queen Victoria set a fashion trend that's still going strong today. What was it? If you said wearing a white wedding dress, you got it. Before Victoria's wedding, brides wore dresses in all sorts of colors, but her choice of white was so iconic that it became the standard. So, how did you do? Did you stump the room? Well, that's our show for today. Thanks so much for tuning in. We've got new episodes out every fortnight, so don't forget to follow on your podcast app of choice and be sure to find us on social media. We are at The Big Smoke Variety. Thanks for listening.